what I heard you just say is that you're having a unique experience that you wanna get me involved in, that I'm actually kind of cracking up about right now. So
Great.
what did you just tell me? Yeah.
2 months ago, in my Naropa classroom, I was having people essentially publicly shaming me for my enjoyment of firearms, to now
Yeah.
those same people reaching out to me asking for help purchasing weapons. And to me, that
Totally.
phenomenon really bizarre. And
Totally. Yeah.
yeah.
It feels funny to me in this moment, and like
Uh-huh.
the funny's kind of superficial. There's a bunch of
Hmm.
other stuff underneath the funny too. Like there's heaviness to it. Obviously, there's irony.
Hmm.
There's fear. There's all kinds of stuff in that. And I think it's worth naming too. I think this is where I come into the conversation. Is it's so interesting that that's being directed at you. I mean, your interest and appreciation for firearms is on the spectrum pretty low. you
Hmm.
know like interest and appreciation, is that the best term, or is like a basic open-mindedness and like some degree of experience? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Totally,
And
yeah. That's one of my, whether it's a redeeming or maybe condemning trait, is that I seem to have a unique ability to get people to hate guns less, because I love them with all my heart,
hmm
and I have good
yeah.
reasons to.
So I guess that partly why I'm interested in talking to you is seeing these previously like kind of bound viewpoints suddenly
Sure.
getting opened up. Really interesting because I think you have a lot to say, at least from what I've heard historically, just about like firearms in general and like what is beautiful about them. And I know I feel concerned about people relating to them from a place of panic around social
Totally.
unrest. Imagining a bunch of liberal college students suddenly armed with no experience kind of freaks me out. I'm like
Yeah,
having
totally.
like a deep framework for how to relate to them, to me seems really potentially useful.
Love it.
Would you be open to talking about how you relate to that
Yeah,
to them?
totally. And I just want to name, that I mean, immediately I'm just struck by how many layers of it there still are. There's like the
Mm-hmm.
practical layer, where I think on some people, on some level, excuse me, some people want to hear things like, go get a Remington 870, 18-inch barrel, 12 or 20 gauge. That'll do you fine. Like, I'm totally open to that level of communication too, explaining why, explaining all of the nuance that goes into saying something so close-minded and limited as, it sounds like you need a shotgun, here's a good one. And then there's the layers you bring up too, of like, how do you build that relationship in a healthy way? I mean, that's kind of the irony in my mind too, is like, it is a relationship. It is scary to think about people getting into it from a panicked place. It's also super exciting. I mean, I love the prospect of, I don't want to say destigmatizing, but I do want to say demystifying. They're not monsters. They're not they're not magic either. They're not, one of the reasons I love firearms is because of the depth of their nuance. If I could snap my fingers and make every firearm in the world disappear, would I? Maybe, yeah. It's and I can't. It wasn't my idea. I relate to the world that I live in, which is a world that's been structured and built by firearms in the most healthy ways that I can find. And that involves having a healthy relationship with firearms. So yeah, I love the way that we're starting this conversation, basically, in terms of not just conceding that, like, yes, we'll tell you what works, but
Mm-hmm.
also will tell you the deeper level of what works. And the deeper level of what works is to have a healthy relationship with everything around you, guns included. Don't let this be an excuse not learn about something that scares, unsettles, or otherwise, you don't want in your life. Let this be an excuse to be more informed, be more educated, and reinforce. I don't want to convince people to like guns. You don't need to like guns, but I do want to convince people to understand them.
Yeah.
If nothing
Yeah.
else, I hope that people who, for the first time, whether it be from a place of fear, whether it be from a place of resentment, whether it be from a place of excitement even, who are
Mm-hmm.
for the first time realizing that whether or not I want to it makes sense to own a gun right now, I hope that those people have some sympathy for the millions and millions and millions of human beings worldwide who have found themselves in that situation before March of 2020.
Yeah.
Because it's not a unique experience. I happen to be a historical collector. I collect guns primarily because I love their history. And yeah, the practical usage appeals to me too, and being in the military now more than ever. But ultimately, the majority of people who own guns don't do so because they want to own guns or because they like guns. They do so because they live in a world where sometimes circumstances dictate that. And I think that's been hard to appreciate in places like Boulder, Colorado, as a college student. Welcome to the rest of the world. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying it's what I want for my kids, but it's what's happening, and I don't see a solution yet. So just, that's, I think, entry-level context of, like, this is why people own guns, usually. Granted, in America, there's kind of unique kind of cultural contexts. There's organizations like the NRA who have done a really weird job of spinning more complex narratives than that, and associations with patriotism and freedom and conservative values and the Republican Party, some of which are justified, some of which are not justified. Look at who passes gun control in the United States. It's not always Democrats. Republicans have passed some of the most wild gun control bills out there. People ask why California is so gun restrictive. Well, it's because a bunch of scared conservatives wanted to disarm Black Panthers who were discovering their constitutional rights to not take shit. So suffice it to say, the American context is uniquely complex, but ultimately the international context is that people own guns because we live in a potentially violent world, and some people don't want to be subject to the negative intentions of others. And there's circumstances where, you and I are big on nonviolent communication, circling, authentic relating. Yeah, I love that. There's a reason I do that. There's also a reason that I generally have a gun in my car. Because I like to be prepared for all range of human experiences. Because I've seen them too. I'm glad that most people haven't had the experience, but the first time that I saw someone who didn't want to get shot to death, I was young. That made an impression on me. And that's not a unique experience in many places of the world.
I think one of the things I'm hearing that I really like is just being able to rely on yourself. I think there's another word for that, but just personal responsibility.
Sure.
In all situations, having the capacity to not be a burden on others, but to actually on behalf of your own needs.
Yeah, and I think it's it's one of those funny things where, like, I mean, if we're to look at society and individuals developmentally, that's an intermittent value. There's like a lower stage of development where, like, that's crucial. I mean, and ultimately it's born out of actual biological evolutionary necessity. For every species other than humans, to a certain extent. Obviously, ecosystems are a thing. Interconnectedness is a fundamental ground of life and creation. But, like, on an individual organism level, the ability to take care of oneself is essential. Okay, on a human level, that's commonly associated with, like, conservative values, kind of traditional societal structures, kind of family-based. Like, our family is self-sufficient. The idea of the farm, the well, raising animals, and then typically the evolution of that is people rediscover interconnectedness. They rediscover expanding senses of self. And they realize that, we really are all in this together. And they kind of their sense of self dissolves into that greater whole. And they begin to identify with, like, these abstract concepts like the greater good, the well-being of all. You get political models which, whether or not they work, espouse the greater good. Things like communism, socialism, things that are typically left of center. And then later, you almost get that reality check where those two seemingly, they're like diametrically opposed, but they're not incompatible. and all of a sudden they start to be able to coexist, where it's like, yes, I am dependent. Yes, I am simply a node in like this web and all of these greater webs, and I'm dependent. I'm so dependent, and I'm independent also. And self-sufficiency is a thing, and individual responsibility is a thing, and individuality is still a thing too, where like, yes, I'm dependent, and I could be in circumstances that only I can address, and only I can address right now. So yeah, I get excited just talking about that. Like, I imagine that, I mean, firearms are kind of a weird window into that. They're obviously very niche. It's not weird to me, but I imagine it's weird to most people. But yeah, it's cool. Because, I mean, that's, why fight something when you can integrate it? You know what I mean? Also, it's hard to fight self-sufficient people, which is honestly one of the big reasons why it's important to integrate it. Because you require the cooperation of those who are self-sufficient, because for one, they're hard to kill. Inevitably, whatever disaster comes, I personally don't think 2020 is the big one where the music stops and everybody has to find a chair. That being said, I do think that day will come. I mean, one day or another, it has to come. That's the way cycles on this planet work. And guess who's going to build the world after that? The people who were able to sustain themselves through it. Let's hope that those self-sustaining people are the ones who also had that other integrated perspective of that interconnectedness and that greater identity of we.
Yeah.
But rest assured, if it's not them, it's going to be the ones from 2 stages back, because they know how to milk cows. They know what season to plant things, and they know how to kill human beings. Just to like maybe plant a seed of love for firearms. Firearms are a funny but very legitimate entryway to a lot of things. I know a lot about metallurgy. I know a lot about Chinese history. I know a lot about Soviet history. I know a lot about Belgian history. I know a lot about insert 80 other countries' histories because I know about their guns. I know a lot about people because I know about the way they use guns. Like, guns are an interesting entryway into a lot of things, which a lot of people find interesting. If someone's a history buff, but they don't want to talk about guns, they're missing out on a pretty big chunk of human history. If you want to talk about physics, there's some real cool physics going on. I have a functional understanding of how cars work because I understand how piston systems in auto-loading firearms work. Like, that's cool. I could retrofit a car to functionally work, firing cartridges into the air and using the recoil forces to power an engine. Like, obviously that would be a terrible idea, but I could do it. Like, that's crazy. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I probably couldn't figure out how to make a fuel injector system work, but I could cobble together a working automotive engine made out of guns that shoot straight up, which is awesome.
That's super cool.
Yeah, that would make car accidents way more dangerous. Also, the feed systems would be complicated. Like, they would probably only run for a little while. But,
Nice.
I could make a grocery getter.
You could go fetch some things.
Yeah, that probably had 6 cylinders of belt-fed machine guns aiming straight up.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, I think the last thing you just said was great, is that they're nested within the human context in an integral way, like through, I mean, not just only mechanics and how things work and function, but systems and how systems work and function, and not only mechanical systems or maybe systems using I don't know, like physical objects, but also cultural systems and why things are the way they are, and war and how humans work.
And exactly that I think that's where the real heart of it is and heart being chosen particularly is I said earlier, I have mixed feelings about guns. I'm not saying they're good. I'm not
Yeah.
saying I endorse them. I'm not saying they're spiritually pure or something like that. But I like them the same way I like people. Like, let's be real honest for a second. Guns are a reflection. I'm not saying they're a complete reflection, but they are a reflection of the human condition. They are a reflection of the human heart. If you can't make your peace with firearms, I don't want to be in your head.
Yeah.
Because I'm guessing there's some conflict real deep down there of like, I'm at peace with myself in many ways because I see the duality in myself that I see in guns, you know? And it's like learning how to use guns responsibly is like learning how to be a responsible person. It's like, yeah, I have dark thoughts. I have bad vibes sometimes. I have selfishness. I have greed. I have these things. I also have all this beauty. I have this brilliance. I have this like raw power. I have all these things. And it's my job to harness them and use all of it for something bigger than me and for something better than me. You know, like, I love that. That's cool.
Guns is a window into the human condition.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think what I'm imagining might be more challenging for people to kind of get to is like the beauty of guns. Like, I think most of us are pretty in touch with the dark side. Well, for me, it's easy for me to associate firearms with people I care about dying.
Sure.
And
I know you well enough to know that you have experiences with that. Like, we both grew up in the same place. There have been people who have died by firearms very close to us. Obviously, many not close to us as well. But there's different reasons why people own firearms, and I'm a collector. That's first and foremost my greatest passion when it comes to firearms. I would say in terms of practical use, I'm rather dispassionate, but I am truly passionate about my collector firearms, which are, you know, historical artifacts. It's really cool, I think, to be able to own something which was at one of the most intense moments in history. You know, World War II, the greatest armed conflict that the world has ever seen. Probably the galaxy. That was a joke. Maybe not a good joke, but a joke. I mean, that changed everything. We live in a world which is shaped by the Second World War. There's something incomparable experientially to me about disassembling even something which on the collector market isn't something which is particularly coveted, but a Soviet standard, relatively crude, 30 million of them made battle rifle, and taking that apart and, you know, like smelling the grease as I disassemble it, and, you know, seeing the copper deposits and the burnt carbon in the grooves of the rifling, and, you know, seeing all the dings and bruises in the wood, and knowing that almost everybody who was there is gone. There's a couple left, but almost everybody who was there is gone now. Some of them have been gone for the entire time. I mean, the Russians lost so many human beings. And knowing that this thing was, like, in some ways, like, it's a bigger conflict, but like that rifle that probably terrified or maybe freakishly brave Russian teenager, old man, whoever was carrying, like, that, probably gripping, like, white knuckling, going in to fight one of the scariest enemies that the world has ever known. I'm holding the thing that he was holding. I'm smelling, I'm seeing it. That's really, it's not just cool, it's beautiful. That's time travel. You know, people make jokes about time travel, you know, and I'll joke back. I've been doing it since I was 15. Like, let me tell you about the places I've been. That's history, you know, and, like, more power to people. Like, I'm not saying that's unique to firearms. I'm sure that people have similar experiences with other things. I mean, artifacts are artifacts. I don't know. My heart led me to those ones. People get into uniforms. Yeah, I bet that's awesome too. You know, kind of same vein. Uniforms bore me. I don't know why. I look at a uniform and I'm like, wow, that's cool. And then I like look at a gun. I'm like, wow, I know what I'm doing for the next week. You know, and then and not just going through that too, but taking it out, shooting it, developing competence with it. like learning the skill. That's great. You know, like that's a whole nother level of connection too, of being like, not only am I looking at this, smelling this, whatever, developing an experiential connection. I imagine it being in many ways a totally different world. Even if I could speak the same language as someone, I would have such radically different experiences. It'd probably be like an alien, more like someone from the future would be an alien, but like that's something I could share with them. That would be a common language that we shared. You know, it'd be like,
Yeah.
hey, like what was your childhood like? Oh, totally different planet than what I grew up in. You don't know about alpha smarts and typing class. You don't know about texting and like the girl that you like not responding to you on AOL Instant Messenger. Oh, you must not have been born in the early to mid 90s. Yeah, but yeah, you know, when the Mosin bolt gets stuck, once it gets a little hot, you got to kind of like smack it with your fist. Like, yeah, I know about that too.
Mm,
So I'll go
yeah.
on forever if you let me, but yeah, something like
Uh-huh.
that.
I think what I just heard there, it reminds me of what you talked about with traditional, like being really self-reliant, then to having this
Sure,
big collective oneness experience and then kind of integrating all of it.
sure,
To
yeah,
me, what you just described was a way to have that connected oneness experience within self-reliance, like how those
sure.
are can actually be within each other and like within the same thing. And
Very insightful. That's something wasn't consciously aware of. Because yeah, I mean, in some ways, I mean, that's your Naropa classmates hippy dippy. You know, like that's
Mhm.
talk about bowing your head and celebrating your connection with all living beings and your ancestors. Yeah,
Yeah.
I honor my ancestors. I think very highly of my ancestors. I look up to them. And guess
Uh-huh.
what? My ancestors, probably like your ancestors, fought with guns. What part of middle school history are people missing? Like, that's where we come from.
Mhm.
That's the water we're swimming in. And yeah, the other piece
Yeah.
too is, yeah, and you develop the skill set yourself as an individual. You develop the
Mhm.
competence. You know, I mean, it's the classic cliche. You know, it's like attributed to Gandhi. I'm not sure. People seem to be under the impression it's like he didn't actually say it, but you know, the classic cliche: be the change you want to see in the world.
Mhm.
I mean, that's practically a koan for this integrity we're describing. Be the change as an individual that you want to see in the community. Like that's the duality. By
Mhm.
developing my skill and appreciation and knowledge of firearms, I am a more deeply integrated part of the human whole. I am closer to others, living and dead, because of what I do with guns.
Feels like a really big statement that
Heck yeah, it
I've never
is.
heard anyone say
Yeah.
before.
And
Yeah.
it's a totally big statement. It's why I put my time into it.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm going to die. I don't know when, but time is of the essence. Why wouldn't I do something that
Hmm.
was big and
Yeah.
that brought me closer to something bigger? And again, you know, like it's a niche. Like I feel like context dependent. You know, I don't think that's the only way to relate to firearms. I think, you know, I just want to, for my own context as much as anything, go back and
Yeah.
just like, yeah, like that's me. Like that's my path or whatever. And other people are going to have radically different ones. But like, come on, like, you know, don't demonize my path, bro. You know what I mean? I don't go knocking your mate straws out of your hand.
Well, I guess right now it seems like there's a really interesting doorway into the path you've kind of uncovered here and
Sure.
being more realized. And
Yeah, yeah,
all
yeah.
the political tension around firearms actually, and these big polarities around relating to them actually is kind of resolving, or at least some of the tension kind of moving through. This might sound really woo, but just our collective experience together. I think what you're saying is like a articulated version of what something possible in terms of decreasing some of that tension. It's a heated topic, you know. Like I've been in we had school essentially canceled a few times because people were protesting guns.
Totally.
That like
Ironic.
so
I'm sorry
yeah.
too. Like,
Hmm.
I just got to interject real quick by saying, like, I have a bachelor's degree in religious studies with an emphasis on Vajrayana. Protesting guns, man. Founder of Vajrayana, the great Tibetan saint. Crazy bastard who killed a bunch of people and practiced black magic and basically discovered enlightenment in one lifetime through crawling down with the bugs. Milarepa.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure Milarepa would have had a gun in his house or a cave or whatever. Would the way that he related to that gun be like pretty mind-boggling? Yeah, I bet it would be. But like, I think that if you walked into his house in the middle of the night, he wasn't going to fucking put a 12 gauge through your chest. Like, I'm not saying there's not karma associated with it. Like, I'm not saying that at all. But it's skillful means. That's what we're talking about here. It's not about the thing. It's about the relationship.
Yeah, that was like ironically missed in my experience at my Buddhist school, which pretty funny.
It's funny to me. It's also, I think it points out one of the shadows of that level of development, which is weapons grade pretentiosity.
Well, it's there seems to be paradoxes everywhere here. At Naropa, it was safe spaces. It's all about safety. It's all about actually having safe spaces. And safety to them means something very interesting. Like it's a key to one's identity, which from everything I'm reading on studies on safe spaces, it seems to create more fragile people. So there's a way where this desire for safety seems to literally be creating less safety. To me, that a lot of what's happening with guns seems to be following this funny trend of similar to like how hoarding is working right now. People like hoarding a lot of things, which is then creating less safety in the world and their need for safety.
And I think I have a good thing to say about that, which I imagine that some people will appreciate. And I will say that particular condition is not unique to like the Naropa style of safe space. Like, I think that's just a fundamental human misperception as to the nature of safety. The desire for safety seems to lead people to create an illusion of safety, which only reinforces their own fears. Real safety comes from strength, and real strength comes from recognizing how fragile one is. Strength comes from acceptance and integration and breaking down walls rather than building them. Like I think real safety is a true internal process. Like, safety comes from recognizing that one isn't safe and that's not a realistic end goal. But to go back to what I said earlier, like, I think the kind of Naropa thing is, people say safe spaces where, they want to create safety by limiting other people's speech or dictating other people's speech so that they don't say things that bring up mental associations that they're incapable of dealing with in a healthy way. Like, these words make me think about these experiences and these things, and I can't process that. So I'm going to make myself feel safe by not having to deal with that situation. Sometimes on the conservative side of the spectrum, we see the same thing. These really fear-based preppers, for example, people who live in fear, and they're like, in order for me to feel safe, I need to be able to kill anything within 1,000 yards of me. And I need to have 3 years worth of food and gas masks for me and my family and my kids and my dog. That's not safety either. That's the same thing. It took me a while to actually process it, but like, safety isn't control. I don't think what people want is safety, because safety is a bit unrealistic. I think people want to be basically fundamentally prepared to handle as many situations with as many options as possible. Like, that's what people want. That's what makes people sleep better at night. It's like, I covered my bases today. Ultimately, this is in God's hands. I can't control this. I'm just a person. But have faith in God, but tie up your camel. I've tied up my camel. I'm not going to be sitting there like a useless, pathetic excuse for an allegedly highly adapted being. I know this is a bit of a callback to what we talked about earlier, but like, that's part of being a human. It's like, if the coyotes in the field over there are going to be better equipped for survival than me, then I probably missed something that my ancestors figured out. It's not about safety. It's about integrating as much skill and wisdom as possible. It's increasing the depth of my tool chest. So,
and earlier you named that was in service of greater wholeness and your ability to contribute to that whole. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I wouldn't say exclusively, but it's certainly true. I mean, I'm certainly doing the gene pool a service when I do that. I'm certainly doing myself as a egoic being a benefit in doing that, because am I going to get hit by a car on the way home? I don't know, maybe. Am I going to be the first one to fucking get killed when everything goes to shit? Maybe. But it won't be my own mistake. It won't be, again, to take is it a hadith? Man, I'm sure.
A little rusty.
Don't let anyone from CU Bursar's office see this or whatever. Revoke my diploma. Just kidding. They hand that out like candy. Not CU, just schools. Have faith in God, but tie up your camel. Do your best, let God do the rest. Don't confuse them. This is me doing my best. I encourage other people to do their best. And once you're prepared adequately, then move on with your life and realize that there's always going to be things out of your control. Or not, whatever. I'm not a life coach. I hear the market is saturated. I'm just a humble gun recommender. I recommend guns.
That's what you do.
And if you can ask good questions, I can answer them. About guns, I mean. I think that a lot of people are coming to the, I would argue, accurate realization they're depending on unstable platforms for basic necessities, unstable institutions.
Yeah.
And that's, more power to them. Good call.
Yeah, that seems like a good thing to be realizing right now. In that realization, I think what I've been witnessing is people discovering there's a lot to create a relationship with, kind of a potentially short amount of time. And so there's a lot of new relationships to kind of really big things.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. That's the crux of it right there. This is survivalist speed dating right now. People want to survive, and they're realizing that in order to cover their bases, they need to build a lot of relationships really quickly. And the thing about building relationships is that there's no shortcut to it. Doesn't mean you can't do it efficiently, but I think in many ways the reason it took us so long to get here is because people are like, hey, I need a gun. And we're saying, no, you need a relationship with violence. That'll be the real crucial variable. Because, ultimately, too, I should name my own bias. Survival is not the end goal. Salvation is. I'm not here to preach to people. Whatever my religious views are don't matter. And some people don't even like the word religious views. Like, sure, spiritual. I don't care. Call it what you want. This isn't a safe space. But I'm not worried about my body. I'm worried about my soul. I'm going to die one way or another. It's probably going to suck when it happens. But I'm either going to die with the peace of knowing that I was a halfway decent person, or maybe even a good person, or maybe even a great person, or I'm going to die with all of the relationships haunting me that I never reconciled. Like, that's salvation. Salvation is reconciling all of your relationships. How is one at peace with themselves? Well, they're at peace with all their relationships. What is there else? It's often, again, because we're potentially talking to some Buddhists. I'm not trying to disparage anyone's faith. Most Buddhists who I've met are normal people who just happen to live in Asia. I don't know. I'm not a census officer. I don't care what people identify as. It's sometimes said that the Buddha didn't reconcile the world. The Buddha reconciled his relationship to the world. Did Mara, did Yama, did Samsara go away? No, they just became friends of the Buddha. The Buddha no longer adversaries because they no longer had any power over the Buddha. The Buddha talks to the devil after enlightenment. Everything is an old friend. Everything is a healthy relationship that's at peace. Like the world didn't change, the relationships did. So that's what I care about. That's what matters to me. To go back, I'm not saying I'm a Buddhist and other people aren't. Like, I'm not a Buddhist. I'm a gun mechanic.
Any tips on building that relationship, especially based on your experience?
Sure. I'm just going to kind of spitball here, but I would say there'd be a few components. First, to go back to something we said earlier, demystify. Cut through the fog. Cut through the dogma. As an individual, build the relationship as an individual. Don't use mine as a template. Don't use someone else as a template. Certainly don't use the media as a template. Discover what things are for yourself. There's a lot of ways to do that. Be a discerning consumer of content. Find resources. watch videos, read articles, learn about
Mm-hmm.
guns from people who don't have an agenda to convince you one way or another. I was going to say, like, handle guns, shoot them. Definitely get your safety fundamentals down. They're not unique in that regard, but, you know, you need a license to drive a car. That makes sense to me. You don't need a license to own a gun. I'm not saying that doesn't make sense. It's the nuances of the politics there is an entirely different conversation. I will summarize my views by saying I'm all in favor of huge numbers of checks and balances and restrictions on firearms. The problem is they get used by people who have ill intent and want to use them as de facto bans. Oftentimes they're also done arbitrarily or abstractly or blatantly done based on misinformation or just disingenuous intent. People make it so hard to get things that it's impossible for people who should have them. Won't go too much further into that. The main thing being guns, like many other aspects of our society, are dangerous. Get your safety fundamentals down. If nothing else, there's 4 rules. Google them in a nutshell. Don't put your finger on the trigger until you're ready to shoot. Know what's behind your target because bullets go through things. Treat every gun like it's loaded. Shoot. Every single time I do this my whole life, I always forget whatever. Whichever one I forget is always different, but I always forget one. Oh yeah, don't point it at something you're not willing to destroy. You know, it's the same thing. Like, we don't have formal rules for things like chainsaws, but it's like, hey, don't touch the chainsaw to something that you don't want to be shredded. Like, yeah, a lot of it's common sense, but demystify, cut through the misinformation, cut through the bias, develop a direct relationship. Same thing, you develop a relationship with anything. To whatever degree possible, take your time. Work your way into it. Don't be that creep who starts talking about kids on the 3rd date. Don't go spending your entire life savings on all the guns you think you're going to need. Get firsthand experience. See what works for you. See what doesn't work for you. Learn the lessons that only time can buy. How do people become good partners? Well, they're bad partners, and then they learn the lessons, and then one day, all of a sudden, they don't suck at being in relationships. Unfortunately, guns are similar. That doesn't mean we can't start now. That doesn't mean it's not going to be a good use of our time. It just means that nothing happens overnight. And, you know, if you got to marry someone because you got them pregnant, or if you got to fucking, despite the fact that you don't have a developed relationship, you got to shoot somebody who's breaking into your house, meaning to do you or your family harm. Okay, it's not the end of the world either. You work with what you got. Just do everything you can to have as much as possible when the time comes. I mean, I think that honestly, far right and far left, generally speaking, relate to guns the same way, which is they relate to them symbolically. You know, to the left, guns are symbols of death, unsafety, anger. You know, people associate guns with Trump. People associate guns with anti-abortion. People associate guns with the Republican Party. Like, come on, God, like, that's not fair. Like, I get why you're there, but the guns didn't choose that. That's not the gun's fault. Come on. Golden retrievers being silhouetted in a cornfield, like, that's a very Republican image. Nobody blames golden retrievers because they be a symbol of a political party, and they had more say in it than the guns did.
And then you'd say the far right relates to guns symbolically also.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. For the same way. They're like, this is freedom. This is my SUV. Runs off liberal tears. My AR-15 has 2 selector modes. Safe space, not safe space. It's a symbol of identity. You're familiar with, like, Carlos Castaneda? You know, like, teachings of Don Juan. Like, you know, Don Juan teaches about trees and the idea of trees. You know, Vajrayana teaches us about meaning generalities. Like, if I tell you Eiffel Tower, you probably create a symbol. Your brain, because it's this beautiful, unbelievable, magical machine, creates this idea of the Eiffel Tower. That's not the Eiffel Tower. When I look at that tree over there, my brain and my sensory apparatus are flooded with data that doesn't come from that tree, but instead come from my symbolic brains association with trees. Guns are the same. So I'm noticing that, like, to a certain degree, we're covering the same territory now. And it's interesting to me, but I imagine that, like, this is almost the vegetables before people get to eat their dessert. And I think the dessert people want is to, like, yeah, okay, got it. Like, because ultimately what we're saying on a certain level is universally true. You can, like, it's like, what should I get for my first car? And there's some jackass somewhere who's like, well, the first thing you need to understand about buying a car is that all cars are intrinsically connected to God, and so are you. And you really just need to honor all of your relations. Like, yeah, like, that's, like, you're right, dude. And I want to buy a car, preferably today, maybe tomorrow. So
we're kind
maybe,
of being that asshole. Is that what you're
huh?
saying? So we're
Yeah.
that asshole.
I mean, I'm the asshole and you're the enabler.
Okay.